Good morning. I don't know about y'all. When I find a saint that I don't know much about, or I discover and I begin to read about them, usually you read about their early life. And so when I see something like, oh, Saint so-and-so, even from like the age of 5, had a very great sensitivity to sin, and immediately I'm like, well, I'm out. That no connection to my experience whatsoever. I mean, they were a saint from like birth. So, how in the world am I going to be able to relate to someone like St. Lawrence of Brindisi, who, even at 6, was known for his eloquence and preaching and in his ability to convey the truth of the Lord despite his age, and then it only increased throughout his life. He lived in the 16th and 17th centuries, born in 1559. He died on his birthday, 60 years later, July 22nd, 1619, in Lisbon. He was named Julius Caesar, Russo or Rossi, depending on some of the information I found. So maybe Francis has some sort of blood connection to this guy, I don't know. I thought it was odd that his parents named him Julius Caesar. I found that sort of strange, but he entered the friars when he was 16 at Verona, and he sort of held all the offices in the order. He was provincial of Tuscany, minister general. I think they called him vicar general at that time, because maybe a century later, in the 18th century, they changed it to minister general from vicar general. So any time that a friar holds these offices is a testament from the friars themselves about an intimate experience they had, which the books don't cover, which the biographies don't cover. Lawrence was a linguist, a preacher, a scholar, a peacemaker, a chaplain, a diplomat, and on and on. But it's not those accolades that I've been praying over and praying with him about. His Franciscan theology, that Jesus would have come anyway, even if Adam hadn't sinned. That love is the source of every divine act, not some reaction of an act of unlove. I find myself in that school. I think that theology is what the world needs at this moment the most, that our God comes to us despite us. Lawrence has this marvelous idea, or not idea, but he has this marvelous way of using Scripture to highlight his points. And one of his points that it really struck me was this idea, or this truth in Scripture, that Christ is the foundation of all created things. And that even if that edifice built on top of that needs repairing, the foundation's still secure. And I think all of us, despite our mechanical abilities, recognize that it's one thing to have a leak on a roof, and it's another thing to have a foundational problem. I think in our church right now, there's no doubt that we don't have a leak on the roof. There's no doubt that we don't need a chimney repointed. But I think the hope, or the silver lining, is that our foundation is still strong because it's Christ. Our foundation is Christ. And I think in our history of Franciscan living, the constant reformations within our order tries to go back to that foundation. And what's the foundations of the Franciscan order? What's Francis and Clare? And why are they a stable foundation? Well, because they built it on Christ. So it's not odd to me that patristic theology and scriptural theology right now is in vogue, because we're going back to that foundation for the repairs that we need to make internally and as a community. Usually what I do when I read a saint is I try to figure out where I relate to them. And what struck me is that when I was praying with St. Lawrence these last few days, it wasn't really where I was relating to them, but how I was filling in those spaces between the words of other Lawrences in my life, of other Lawrences in the order. Because you don't hear mentioned in the biographies the friars who made sure he had his food packed before he went on his mission. You don't hear the friars who maybe accompanied him and prayed for him as he preached. Lawrence is sort of the individual that's being highlighted by the church for one reason or another, but there's no such thing as an individual isolated from a connection of relationships which influence how that individual expresses him or herself. This morning I took Ronaldo to the airport. We left at 5. He had to wake me up, by the way. And it struck me because I thought, this is what it would have been like for the friar supporting someone like St. Lawrence. There's no mention of them in the books. There's no mention of them in history per se. But they're just as much as an important part of the gift of a saint or a doctor to the church as the doctor or saint in the church themselves, I think. You can't isolate it. I think most of history that way. I think our reality is that way, and that more is said in between words than the words themselves. I've decided to use a lot more silence in my preaching now than I ever did before, because I realize it's in the pauses that reality exists, not in my words. I've been thinking of habits. What's the difference between a good habit and a bad habit? I don't think there is such a thing as a good habit. Because habit implies you're not conscious when you're doing this thing. You're not there. Brushing your teeth is a good habit. But when I'm brushing my teeth, I'm thinking about the paper I need to finish. I'm thinking about what I got to do for the weekend. I'm not even there in the moment of brushing my teeth. And I call that a good habit. Why is it a good habit not to be present? I don't know. St. Lawrence was able to do what he did because he was present to the Lord before he did what he did, as he did what he did, and after he did what he did. And that's the idea, that I'm fully and completely present to the Lord in everything that I express myself in. Relating to St. Lawrence, how do you relate to someone who has such a foreign experience to you? I've thought about this, especially in my studies in psychology. If someone sits down in front of me and they're suffering from schizophrenia, how could I possibly relate to someone who has hallucinations and is totally foreign to the reality in which I live? How do I establish a relationship to that? Well, I know what it's like to dream. And for people who suffer from schizophrenia, they can't turn that off. Mine turns off when I wake up. Ours turns off when we wake up. Theirs doesn't. So one entry point into relationship is seeing how in my life I can connect with them, even though it seems on the surface our experience is totally different. People who suffer from dementia, we call it a senior moment, but I forget things all the time. We don't call it a junior moment. Why is that? You know, why is that? So the real challenge I've had in preparing for St. Lawrence is that sometimes it takes some creativity to find a connection. But believe and have faith that there's always an entry point into relationship. Because if you begin with, oh, they were 6 and they were holy, I'm out, then now I'm saying I am impossible to be in relationship with this person. That's not helpful. It's not what the gospel calls us to. One of the research sites that I found on St. Lawrence said, despite being a scholar, he was compassionate to the needs of the people. I thought, well, I guess what they're saying is if you're a scholar, you're not usually sensitive to the needs of people. Is that what you're saying? I'm glad Tom's not here today. But that I think was the concern of Francis, is that if we get too far in our head, we get further away from people. And Lawrence had an ability to use his gifts of scholarship and language, his gift of preaching, his gift of diplomacy, in a way that it didn't lock him up in his head, in a way that he was still a brother. And you read about, of course, we know hagiography, we read about the highlights of someone's life. We don't read about the internal strife. If I know the human condition, I bet friars were incredibly jealous. At least some of them were incredibly jealous of his renown. He's called upon by popes and bishops and emperors to go here, to go to Europe, to go out. They called on him. Well, what about me? The Pope never calls on me. He calls on Cardinal Sean all the time. He never calls on me. That's me being locked up in my head. That's ego consciousness. It's what I don't have that someone else has, that I want. I was sharing with Alex last night, when I meet someone who's kind of innocent, and we know these people, they're just innocent, a part of me is frustrated with that. I'm jealous of a blessing, because that wasn't my experience. My experience and others' experiences sometimes don't allow for that innocence to perdure for very long in life. You see this in sexual abuse. You see this in neglect. You see this in poverty. That something about that eviscerates innocence quickly. But if I find myself being jealous of someone who's been able to remain in their innocence, I'm denying my possibility that I have a foundation strong enough on Christ that I can recover my own. St. Lawrence was proclaimed the doctor of the church by St. John the 23rd, and I don't think in 1959, I remember somewhere I saw a picture of the friars gathered at the National Shrine for this event. It's just a whole sanctuary full of brown. No liturgical color appropriateness there at all. So it sort of stands out. And I thought, that's the heritage. That's the connection. That because of our baptism, because of our vows, St. Lawrence lives on. The friars who have gone before us live on. The saints and the sinners. The saints and the sinners. We remember them at dinner, those who have passed away on their anniversary of death. We don't just remember the ones who were establishing friaries or guardians of Cap College or provincials. We remember all the friars, because all of those friars are as integral to each other as the ones who stood out as foundational, vanguards, great preachers. So there's an important link in our life that we often miss, that I'm important to your gifts, and you're important to my gifts. That Steve making habit in the attic is essential, not accidental, to Paul's preaching in the Archdiocese, or to Dave's work in Peace and Justice. It is essential, not accidental. Because the foundation there is strong. Because the foundation there is Christ. It's futile to separate them back into individuals. Just like it's futile to sort of separate an individual from the environment in which they arise from the home in which they come from. Home is the one place that you can never get back to and the one place you can't get away from. That sticks out to me. So everything that I do, home comes out in that expression, even if I'm not conscious of it. Everything St. Lawrence did, his fraternity came out through it. So when our brothers are doing marvelous things, we're there in that. When Cardinal Sean gives a talk at CUA or when he goes to Rome, we're there in that. We're supporting that, and that becomes essential. Me taking Rinaldo to the airport this morning, I think, is essential to his mission when he gets to think he's going to Idaho or Iowa. So his preaching in Iowa is essentially connected to my support of him as a brother in driving him to Dulles, though I'll never step foot in Iowa or Idaho in the next week. We have a lot of saints, brothers, I think, because we have fraternity. I don't think we would have the saints without the fraternity, because it's an expression of our life. St. Lawrence was known for converting a lot of Jews in Rome, and I'll end with really sharing a struggle with you that I find in St. Lawrence about his zeal, and really in anybody that I find zeal in evangelization. I don't know how to do it without imposing. St. John Paul II said, the church at her best proposes, not imposes. And there's such an anxiety today about imposing upon someone. So St. Lawrence for me is a model of courage in his evangelization. He's a model for me in his fraternal responsibilities that he maintained even throughout his schedule. It's not incidental, as I said before, that I think St. John the 23rd proclaimed him a doctor of the church right before the Second Vatican Council, because he really was a model of what it looked like to be a saint in the modern world. Lawrence was very busy. He traveled, he wrote, he engaged. He was a political genius. He was a diplomat. He was a military hero. He would have been a great Archbishop of Washington, I think, to navigate what our reality is here. So I don't think that's inconsequential that John the 23rd proclaimed him a doctor right before Vatican II. Because it was the Council of Trent that Lawrence found his mission in working with during the Protestant Reformation. So how are we working from our council in the modern world? How are we working from our fraternity in the modern world? How are we evangelizing in the modern world? And how are we supporting the evangelizers in the modern world? It doesn't take a whole lot. Sometimes it just takes a trip to the airport.